Welcome to Carbon Neutral by 2030 for Grand Rapids, featuring Missy Stultz from the city of Ann Arbor. Thank you all for joining the session. My name is David Haast. I'm with the event organizer, Grand Rapids Climate Action. Here's a quick outline of the proceedings. Dr. Stultz will speak first and respond to questions. Next, we'll hear from a couple members of the planning team for the City of Grand Rapids Community Collaboration on Climate Change. This will be followed by a few words from GRCA as a transition to an open discussion on Grand Rapids achieving community-wide carbon neutrality by 2030. There are a number of people on this session. We had over 150 registered. There may be 100 or more on here right now. So fair warning, most people won't get to speak, but we'll be looking at the Q&A. Our moderator will, and we'll call on as many people as we can. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for the event, GVSU's Climate Change Education Solutions Network, Climate Witness Project, Citizens Climate Lobby, and Sierra Club Michigan. I would especially like to thank our co-host, Michigan Climate Action Network, who've done an incredible job designing everything and who are running this whole show technically. We truly could not have done this without you. Our moderator is Margreta Kearney, Senior Staff Attorney for the Environmental Law and Policy Center in Grand Rapids. Many of you know that Margreta and ELPC are important allies regionally, statewide, and locally in the climate emergency. We're very happy to have her here to introduce Dr. Stultz and to bring her own expertise as moderator. Margreta?
Thanks, David. I'm very excited to be here and glad that we are, and give me a thumbs up to make sure everyone can hear me. All right, good. I'm glad that we are able to continue these types of conversations, even though it's difficult to get together in person. So just want to thank you, David, and your group for pulling people together to continue to have these important conversations. I'm very excited and pleased to be able to introduce Missy Stultz, who in my world is a little bit of a unicorn because she is somebody who in her work with the city of Ann Arbor is both setting amazing goals for climate and for carbon neutrality, and also talking about the hard truths and the difficult path to be there. I'm not going to do the traditional introduction of all of the many things that she has done and accomplished. She is phenomenally well educated, phenomenally experienced, and all in this game. So what I'm going to do is just kind of put it over to Missy. For those of you who aren't familiar with the city of Grand Rapids and some of the work that they've been doing, they really are, or the city of Ann Arbor, they really are a leader in Michigan in terms of setting some discrete and some clear planning for climate action. So we're really excited to hear Missy talk about that and to talk with her about some of the hard things and the easier things in meeting our goals. So thank you, Missy, for being here.
Margreta, thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for welcoming all of us into your homes. It is true, it would be lovely if we could do this face to face, but I look forward to having this conversation with you in the virtual. Oh, all right, I think we're back on. Yeah, we're back. Okay, great.
Can I just introduce?
Yeah.
I'm gonna interrupt you for just 1 second too, because I'm a lawyer, and as a lawyer, I have to do certain things. And one of them is I just want to point out to everybody that we are recording this session. So that's something that we just want to make sure everybody's aware of, because we know there are sort of privacy implications and things like that. So just to put it out there, we're recording the session and making it available.
Very important detail. That's great. So I am gonna ask Bill, would you mind allowing me to have co-host responsibilities so I can share my screen?
I'm just going to make you the host because for some reason I'm not able to co-host you, but I'll
Brilliant.
switch you over.
You got it. Well, I'm going to talk as we set this technical funness up here. So everybody, hi, my name is Missy Stultz. I am the head of the Office of Sustainability and Innovation in the city of Ann Arbor, and I am pretty lucky. I'm only actually coming in on my 2nd year in that position. Don't look at these slides. Hold on, please. So let me get this up here for you. So I lived in Ann Arbor before I took this role, was lucky enough to go to school there, live there, recreate, be involved in lots of commissions. So I've kind of been involved in the climate work in Ann Arbor from lots of different perspectives as an advocate and of course now as a staff member. And so I'm happy to talk about all those different perspectives. What I want to do in our brief time together today is kind of do a whirlwind overview of how we got to our carbon neutrality plan and where we're going from here. And then I want to open it up for questions. So I'm going to talk really fast. I always do. And I might not spend a lot of time in a certain detail, and that's fine. I will monitor the chat boxes and I will happily answer questions, and you're welcome to get in touch with me after if you have any questions about what we did. So I know the slide's a little bit blurry as we blow it up. This is in our 5-year work plan for the office, and it's basically the timeline, a little bit of history. We've been working on this issue for a really long time. So in 1981, we formed our first advisory board on something related to climate. It was our Energy Advisory Board. And that became a really important heartbeat for the work of the city. It actually helped us get an energy plan adopted. And that energy plan has really been the backbone, a lot of the work that you see here, and it's continually updated. We joined a number of national and international initiatives, kind of built momentum. In 2001, we formed an environmental commission, which was broader in scope, not just energy, thinking more holistically about all different aspects of environmental issues, especially solid waste for us. That was really important here in the community. 2007, we became a Solar American city. You can kind of move through as you get to 2012. The city adopted its first climate action plan, and the goals in that action plan were a 15% greenhouse gas reduction by 2015, which we met, a 25% reduction by 2025, and a 90% reduction by 2050. And at that time, that really was representative, if not a little bit ahead of what the science was saying. But as we all know, you're on this call because you realize climate change is the most pressing issue of our time, arguably the most pressing issue. I would say systemic racism is right there. Those two things are intertwined, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But the science has changed significantly in terms of telling us what needs to happen. So you can kind of follow this path through, and what you see is in 2019, our city council unanimously adopted a climate emergency declaration. And at the time they adopted that declaration, and I'm happy to talk about what these are. I think most of you on the line know about them. That's why you're here. That declaration was paired with a commitment for our entire community, every resident, business, this large university you may have heard of, for all of us to be carbon neutral by 2030. And then they gave staff until March 30th, 2020 to create a plan for how we were going to achieve carbon neutrality by the end of the decade. So what you see is 2020. I will spoil if you don't know the news. It took us a while, but on June 1st, technically June 2nd, because we had gone over midnight, our city council unanimously adopted what's called our A20 carbon neutrality plan. So we now have a directional path towards how we're going to achieve carbon neutrality, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So to take a step back, we do greenhouse gas inventories, as do you, to understand the emissions profile. Of course, you can't effectively manage what you don't measure. So we wanted to understand where emissions are coming from in our community. Our first inventory was of 2000, and you can see about 2.5 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions or carbon dioxide equivalents. We take all of the greenhouse gases, we make sure we get them all on par, and then we can say metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent is sort of how we talk when we talk about emissions. And so the good news is we've been trending down, right? Of course, we're aiming for 0. So we have to take what's been a nice declining curve and we have to have a precipitous drop off. And so we basically reset and we said, great job historically, but our emissions profile, 2018 was the most updated inventory we have. We're about to close out books for 2019, but basically we're talking about 2.1 million metric tons that we've got to close out. And when we do inventories, as you probably know, we look not just at absolutes, but we need to understand the sources. And that's what you see for you on the right, and the sectors. What sector is emitting that? Now, this looks different for Ann Arbor than it does in Grand Rapids, guaranteed. We have no industrial base, and the largest emitter in our community is the University of Michigan at 1/3 of emissions. So as we were going through our emissions profile, we needed to understand what are we doing to really target transportation emissions, which are 17% of emissions. And that may not seem high, and it is actually low if you look at national averages, because we have a pretty compact community, we have great walkability, and we have really good public transit service. But here's what I do know, those emissions are rising. And so we've got to figure out how we kind of balance all of those sources. You also can see on the graph on the right, the majority of our emissions come from a really dirty electric grid, followed by natural gas combustion. So it's mostly stationary combustion is what is causing our emissions. So we know the baseline, and then we said, okay, we have to have very clear stated values that align with the values of our community to guide this work, because we could go in lots of different directions to figure out what it's going to mean to be carbon neutral. And so we led with 3 values, and these values guided our process, and they guide the implementation, and they also guided what got into the plan. So equity is front and
It's working
center.
the way it was supposed to.
Those that bear the disproportionate burden of climate change are those that have done the least to contribute to the problem. Also, many solutions, it's really easy to think about, that effectively the affluent can access. And so how are we leading with equity in the work that we do? Bringing different voices to the table, finding different solutions, leading with actions that maybe don't have the biggest bang for their buck right out the gate, but actually build the coalition to have really true lifelong transformative change, which gets to the last value we have. Sustainability is a core value of our work. Of course, we don't want this to sit on a shelf. We need it to be living, to be iterative. I guarantee you this is wrong, what I'm about to show you, because it can't be right. I can't see the future. I don't know what technology is going to look like in 10 years. So everything we did was directional. And then lastly, transformative. And this is really, really important for a number of reasons. But the way I explain it when I'm talking very quickly is this. The status quo is simply unacceptable. If you look at the status quo, it tells us that we are on track for climate chaos. We're already experiencing climate impacts that are disrupting our communities and costing us billions, if not trillions of dollars domestically. That future, continuing under business as usual, is not a future that I'm willing on accepting. Moreover, technologies change, our economy needs to shift, and we have systemic racism. We have an unjust society. Business as usual perpetuates all of those things, or at a minimum allows them all to continue. I'm not going to get on that train, and I don't think you want to be on that train either. And that leads to one option, which is transformative change. We have to change the system. And so that's part of the DNA of the work that we're doing. So the bullets underneath talk a little bit about the characteristics that we brought to bear in the process, or that we use right now to live these values out. And these, again, are constantly changing. And then, of course, we have to have a vision, because people are not inspired by doom and gloom. I can talk a lot about the research around this. People are inspired by a vision that they want to be a part of and seeing themselves in that vision. So the vision that we have, and we did hire a graphic artist, and hopefully we'll be able to continue working with them to design a lot of the visualizations of what it means to be carbon neutral. But our vision is that together, we're creating and implementing a just transition to community-wide carbon neutrality by 2030. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about our process, and this will be high level. We explain this as a funnel. And so what you see at the top are the inputs into that. So we definitely had lots of public input, and I'll walk through that in a second. We worked with our peer cities, including Grand Rapids, Detroit, Traverse City, Dearborn, Flint, a lot, and internationally, as well as throughout domestically. We're super connected, and I know Alison's on the line, Alison Sutter, the head of sustainability for Grand Rapids, and she can talk a lot about that. We're involved in a lot of peer networks together, and she is a rock star through and through. We also, of course, have staff expertise. You know, I am an expert in resilience, and so I bring that to bear in the work that we do. And we had technical advisory committees. We had 86 individuals who donated their time in this process to help us understand what was technically possible, but we did not just take their word for it. Because just because it's technically possible does not mean it's socially feasible. And so all of these things had to intersect with each other. And so those are the inputs that went into our process, as well as peer-reviewed and gray literature, things like Project Drawdown we pulled from. And phase one, the opening of that funnel, was what we called ideation. Anything anyone put on the table, we considered. Just bring your ideas, bring lots of things to bear. The second phase was the middle of the funnel, and that was our initial prioritization, where we had to start putting a filter on things. And then the last was really focusing on how. So now we know what we're going to do, but how are we going to do it? And how are we going to do it in a way that aligns with those values I articulated? So to give you a sense, we had 82 working days because of the holidays and because of when we started. So that's 82 working days that staff had to do this process. In that time, we ran 3 public surveys. The first one was the smallest at about 240 respondents. The last 2 had about 1,000, if not over 1,000 respondents to those surveys. So they were scientifically valid. We had 68 public events that we hosted in those days. We actually had 80 scheduled. We had to cancel 12 due to COVID. We had 2 large town halls. We had 80 technical, as I mentioned, 86 technical advisors. And we had 66 partner organizations that we used to help get the word out and bring non-traditional people to the table. And I'm really proud of this team that I get to oversee and work with for the engagement process that we went through in a really tight time frame. So we have this plan that was adopted, which is very, very exciting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the plan because as you move forward, you're going to have to figure out what makes sense for Grand Rapids. But I did want to say we don't just have a plan. We have a governance framework because our plan is living. Our plan will change, but we needed to understand and articulate how it would change. So who's responsible for shepherding the plan forward? Well, that's the Office of Sustainability with the city administrator. What role does city council play and when do they come in? How do residents interact? When will we change actions in the plan? And so the governance framework, which is available on our website, walks through how this actually becomes a living document and how input will continually be revised and integrated. We also have a prioritization framework. Everyone has an idea on this phone right now of what you think the most important thing is that we should be doing to be carbon neutral. I'm going to guess that not all of us are going to agree on the top 5 things that we should be doing. And so how do we evaluate those ideas? Every action in our plan had to go through this prioritization framework. It had to be held to a certain level of rigor. So some of those ideas in our plan are not going to work. Guaranteed. We're going to try them and they are not going to succeed. That's not a failure if we learn from it. If we learn from it and do something different, I actually think that's acceptable. But when we bring in new candidate strategies, we can't just kind of put our finger to the wind and say, this is where we think an opportunity exists. We've got to have that same level of rigor that we went through to put our candidate strategies in. And so everything that comes forward will have to be evaluated through this framework. And then lastly, we have an investment scenario. When this plan came out, the dollar figure associated with it was $1 billion with a B dollars. And that was acknowledging what we would need if we were starting from zero. Well, we're not starting from zero. And honestly, when you focus on cost, you forget everything else. You forget the fact that many of the strategies in our plan are actually investments. They're investments for homeowners or businesses that will return results. And in a certain number of years, energy efficiency will reap a savings. Sometimes that savings will come to the person who pays the upfront cost, and sometimes it will not. So if I'm running a program as a city, I am not going to get benefits that my residents get. But that's still a worthwhile investment for us because our job is to protect the public health and safety and general welfare of our residents. So that makes sense to me. And I'll tell you at the end, the last form of this investment scenario, just kind of as a thought piece. So lots and lots of co-benefits, you know these, they're there. We identify that this is not just about climate action. That motivates me, but it doesn't motivate everyone else that I have to get motivated to take action in the next 10 years. So overall, we have 7 strategies and 44 actions in our plan. I'm going to just tell you what the 7 strategies are, and then I'm going to show you very quickly 44 and not talk about them. Because the 7 strategies, if anything, are the most transferable for anyone in the state to be thinking about. These 7 strategies are the backbone. They're the pillars of our work. These are unlikely to change, if at all, in this process. The actions, the 44 things that surround them, are much more likely to change. So here are our 7 overarching strategies. Number 1, we have to power our electrical grid with 100% renewable energy, full stop. 2, we've got to switch our appliances from gas, coal, propane, diesel, all over to electric, especially as that electric grid is getting cleaner, right? You cannot make natural gas clean, period. 3, we need to improve the energy efficiency and everything in our lives. Wherever we are sitting right now, there's opportunities for improvement. What's different in this strategy is historically, we would do these 3 things separately. We would do energy efficiency, maybe we do some distributed generation, rooftop solar, geothermal, and then maybe we would switch out an appliance as we went. We're trying to figure out how we wrap all 3 of these together because, put very simply, we do not have time to face these 3 things in the work that we're doing in the community. 4 is about land use and transportation emissions. We need to reduce the vehicle miles we travel in our cars by at least 50%. Congratulations, COVID has shown us what's possible with telework, with repurposing our streets for pedestrians and for bicycles. So there's opportunities here, but this is also about land use. What do we prioritize and where do we prioritize where we put it? The 5th is inherently about a circular economy. We have to stop producing waste. Everything has a useful utility. We just have to think differently about how we repurpose that and restart the economy so that things can be repurposed. 6th is about resilience. Despite everything else that we are going to do, we already experience the impacts of climate change, and those impacts are going to get worse. We need to be investing in the resilience of our people in our place, and we need to lead with our frontline populations who once again are disproportionately burdened by the impacts of climate change. And then we have a catch-all, which is our others. These are actions that belong in no category above because they belong in every category above. So those are things like our equity work. We believe fundamentally that equity is, you're hearing it, I'm going to keep saying it. Alison is someone I look up to in terms of how she thinks about this work in Grand Rapids. How are we making sure that equity is front of mind in all of the work that we do? And this can be really uncomfortable for those of us like myself who come from a more traditional environmental background where we are not trained, candidly, to talk about racial inequalities in our system, to talk about race openly and candidly. But this is really, really important if we're actually going to be successful in this critical work. We need to be allies with our partners fighting the injustices that exist within our system. So we have 44 actions. They are listed here, and they all focus on those 7 strategies I just shared with you, and they're sort of the infrastructure around it. These are our top priorities for this coming fiscal year, which started for us on July 1st. Pretty wide ranging, as you can see. A lot of focus in here on our energy work and focusing on low-income households in our energy work. You'll see weatherization expansion and helping the Aging in Place program is focused on helping low-income seniors age in a place of their choosing for longer and having better health outcomes in that work. The other thing that's on this slide is building the coalition and the support that we need to be wildly successful in this work. So this is the last slide I want to share with you. I was talking about the investment cost to do this work. It is true that it will cost money to do this work. It is also true that not doing this work costs money. And we haven't done a very good job as a field of talking about the social cost of inaction or the cost of inaction, period. So what we did, working with partners that we have in our community, similar to many of you on this line, or partners in your individual communities, we calculated the social cost of carbon associated with our greenhouse gas emissions as a city between 2000 and 2018. So this is the same graph that I started with. We use $55 a ton, which is sort of right in the middle. You'll see people who argue that's $0 a ton. That's pretty laughable. You'll see people that go to like $1,500 a ton. That's pretty high. So we just took the average. And at a $55 a ton, just over these 18 years, the community of Ann Arbor owes society $2.3 billion. So when I talk about a plan that's going to cost roughly $1 billion, of which we already have quite a bit of the money through our existing programs, and I think that we can actually leverage those dollars to get more dollars, it forgets, when we focus on that number, that the cost that we already owe and the cost that will continue to grow as we fail to make investments in being carbon neutral. So this is just a counter argument when people say, but like, this is so expensive. My response is, it is far more expensive not to do something about this. So with that, I'm gonna stop and take any questions or constructive feedback you have.
Yeah, thank you, Missy. And there, we do have definitely some hands raised. And if folks want to either text questions or in the chat or raise their hand, I'm happy to moderate that. But I did want to start off with just kind of an overarching question. Can you describe the role that community activism and community organizations played in getting to the finding of a climate emergency and getting to the passage of the carbon neutrality plan?
Yeah, it was critical, and it's been a continual drumbeat through the work that we've done. So when I came to Ann Arbor, I was one of those activists as part of a climate partnership that I got involved in, and we were supporting the city, helping push the city to think, to supplement the expertise on staff, or even just the capacity, because there is no way staff can do this completely by themselves. And then the climate emergency declaration actually came from our climate mobilization group in town. They went to our energy commission, our environmental commission, shared the resolution, got them to adopt it, and then it worked its way up through council. And so it was actually really critical to get citizen support and activist support in particular, and focused activist support. I think that's the other thing that we miss. We tend to activate on lots of different things, and that's just noisy and hard to pay attention to. This was focused activism.
Okay, and I know that in some cities, like in Grand Rapids, and also I believe the city of Kalamazoo, we got a comment on, has an environmental concerns committee or their energy advisory committees that help to advise the city's planning departments. Does Ann Arbor have a structure like that, and has it been useful in terms of pushing your goals?
Yeah, so we have an environmental commission and an energy commission that our Office of Sustainability and Innovation supports. The Energy Commission has been pretty important in helping us kind of frame a lot of the energy related work. The Environmental Commission has been super, super helpful, but tends to focus on, at least historically, things like solid waste or water quality and PFAS for us, which is really important. So definitely critical in helping support the city. They care a lot about climate action, but they also, by nature of their composition, tend to care about other things in kind of the environmental space. So to the point, yes, our commissions play a really, really important role in helping supplement staff expertise, helping make sure they're advisors to council. So making sure council kind of stays aware of the finger of the pulse, you know, if you will, of people that really are concerned about these different areas. And they're allies. I mean, they're people we bring things to and run ideas by, and they form work groups with us and work with us, certainly. So we work with them once a year on a work plan that really tries to keep them, so we can support them best and they can have product at the end. It is not perfect. We have a lot of work to do, and so I would welcome anyone's ideas and suggestions on that. But
okay, so it sounds to me like one of the pieces of advice you'd have for people who are on those types of committees and thinking of forming those is two of the really helpful things are to have people with subject matter expertise, and then to have those people engage directly with the council and with the ultimate decision makers. Is that fair?
I think that's fair on the commissions.
Okay, great. So now I'm going to go to some of the phone, some of the folks who would like to ask some questions. So first I'm going to go to Nathan, who has his hand raised, and I just hit the button that should allow you to talk, Nathan. So let's see if we can hear you. We cannot hear you. I think you're muted, Nathan. All right. I think you're still muted. So Nathan, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to move on, and I'm going to give George Hartwell permission to talk and see if we're able to hear him or if we have a systemic problem. George, are you there?
Marvette, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you, George. So we'll come back to you, Nathan. But George, why don't you go ahead with your question?
Well, thank you. Missy, George Hartwell here, and I have certainly always looked on you as one of Michigan's climate heroes. So it's a real honor to have you on this call tonight. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask you, please, to talk about how you have overcome opposition along the way, whether that's been community opposition, neighborhood opposition, even national opposition.
Yeah, and Mayor Hartwell, I am so delighted to see your name too as a leader of this work for a really long time, and someone that I admire and look up to for being able to navigate the political discourse, which is often very, very challenging. To your question, how we handled any form of opposition, one is my philosophy is that opposition exists no matter what, and so I tend to invite it to the table at the beginning. And the example that I'll share, the one that came to mind, is one of the things that we know we're going to have to work on is rental housing. We're 55% rental in Ann Arbor, and our rental housing varies in terms of quality. And so we are working on an energy efficiency requirement for rental housing. And I'm pretty sure you could imagine that's not going to be loved by a lot of landlords, right? It's another requirement that's sort of out there. And so we made a decision that we were going to invite the Washtenaw Area Apartment Association to serve on one of our, to serve as an advisor, and also to serve on one of our technical advisory committees, so they could be at the table sharing those concerns, and we could actually hear them and try to integrate them into the process up front. And part of that was also recognizing they weren't necessarily opposed to what we were proposing. They were opposed to things that have happened historically and feeling like their concerns aren't regularly addressed. And so understanding that allowed us to work with them to get those initial concerns addressed, and we built trust. And so we're at a point where I don't think they're going to come out and lobby council to adopt a green rental efficiency standard, but I also don't think they're going to show up in opposition to it, because we're getting to a point where trust has been built and they understand this is something that has to happen to meet our goals. They also have made it very clear to us, and we agree that it can't just happen in our rental. So we're going to come forward with a package, most likely, of work around efficiency standards for not only rental units, but then doing disclosure ordinances for commercial and single family homes at the same time. So the entire market feels the impact. So the point of that is to say, I believe you bring the opposition to the table. You don't bring climate deniers to the table because you're not going to get anywhere. But those who really do authentically want to engage with you and have concerns, we need to hear them and understand them. So I make room at the table and I break bread with people.
So in that same vein, Missy, one question is, I assume that there was probably some opposition from business who might see this as something that could be difficult for them in terms of operations. What kind of role did businesses have in the plan, and have you found that you're getting a decent level of support?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Main Street Association was one of our partners. So we brought in our downtown businesses. We asked all of our business associations, to be formal partners in the process. And we sent out invitations at the very beginning to lots and lots of different stakeholders. We also asked we have the Zingerman's chain of business is really popular and pretty iconic here. So we asked them to be partners, and I went and presented to their board and talked about this work. And so we brought their input in from the very beginning. So we didn't really hear a lot of opposition. The only time I heard opposition was when we were going for final vote, and clearly an email had been circulating, and I'm going to posit that that was seeded by perhaps our utility, that suggested the electrification portion of our work would be prohibitively expensive for our businesses. And so businesses, there was this like form letter that was circulating, and everyone who sent it to me, I talked to about the electrification work and explained that it's all voluntary and that we're trying to pair it with all these different incentives. And every single person either said, sign me up, I want to do that work, like I want to be one of your first volunteers, or they said, well, that's not what I heard. Well, I feel much better about it. So again, opposition for me, I just call it. I think you just got to talk to people. There's very few people that I've met who are hard-nosed on this work. They just need to be heard.
Well, you mentioned a group there that I think might be a little more challenging than some others to deal with, and that would be the utilities. How have your engagements with DTE been on these subjects?
All over. So DTE was on our technical advisory committee. We had 4 technical advisory committees, one on energy, resilience, transportation and mobility, and waste reduction. So I served on the energy TAC. They gave their ideas and suggestions. Often those were shot down by other technical advisory committee members as not being progressive enough to meet those goals and objectives. So I would say our strategy with our utility is honesty. It's trying to find opportunities for collaboration. It's bringing new ideas to them and saying, you know, this is coming. This wave is coming. Use us as an innovative test bed for these new things, whether that's community solar in our state or whether that's thinking about a new program through the voluntary green pricing initiative where municipalities get a better deal. Like there's just all kinds of stuff that we talk to them about. We have a weekly check-in with the utility now. So every week I get on the phone with them to talk about the carbon neutrality work. And I think it's a combination of sincerity and interest in the topic and straight out fear.
So one of the things that keeps coming up over and over again, and I loved your response to it, is the price tag associated with the plan. And while I understand the argument that there's a price tag associated with not engaging in the plan, municipalities don't tend to budget in that way, right? There isn't a line item in the budget for stuff that's going to happen if we don't deal with climate change. So how have you figured out how to identify, you know, sources in the budget and ways that you'll be able to fund this plan?
So the investment scenario that we have looks at things the city already does that could be leveraged or repurposed. So if this is a serious goal of the city, this has to be foundational to the work that we do. I think that this really becomes an organizing document for us. And so from that perspective, I was able to look and work with our solid waste team to say, what is our solid waste budget around recycling and composting and working on refrigerant issues? And they were able to share. And we said, well, great, we already have all of this money that we use. How do we pivot that to really focus on a circular economy? And so, you know, that was $22 million. Don't quote that. That might not be the right number. It's in the investment plan, but it was a lot of that money. My office has a budget. Everything that my office does is around carbon neutrality, right? And so I'm working with all of the other units to really take the work that they do and make sure that it's about smart investment. So the CIP, our capital improvements plan, how do we make sure that no project gets in there that's not a carbon neutral project, or that if it does, it has offsets? And then the last thing that did not make it into our budget because of COVID, but I worked with our CFO, our chief financial officer, who's now our acting city administrator on this project, is we're gonna pilot an internal carbon tax. So we can't use it externally, but I have all of the data for every single unit in the city. And we applied a $5 a ton, which, as you know, is super, super low, but to kind of like normalize it, a $5 a ton impact to their energy spend. So we can understand what it is, like start normalizing that idea of there is actually a counterfactual for the decisions we make. And so get that up to a price, because at the end of the day, we still have to pay the price of inaction. We pay the price for disaster response. We pay the price for emergency response. We pay the price for flood mitigation, heat waves, public health crises. Like we're paying that cost. And so it's there. It's just not built into our budgets in that way. So we're trying to really connect the dots between those things.
Yeah, the economist in me loves to hear you say that. And frame it in that way. I suspect that there are a lot of folks who might look, though, at things that are going on right now with COVID, reduction in tax revenues, some of the issues that we've had with racial injustice in our cities and inequitable provision of services in places where there haven't been as much investment as other places. How do you kind of work in the climate goals to those different areas where it might not seem as obvious to people that there is even a connection?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is COVID has shown us who is bearing the disproportionate impact, right? in terms of a public health system that hasn't really invested in people, in terms of redlining and where we put our frontline populations, primarily our Black and Brown and Indigenous neighbors. We're putting them in harm's way. They are disproportionately bearing the burden of COVID. And we can see that in Michigan for sure. Those are the exact same people that are disproportionately bearing the burden of climate change, right? So anything that we can do to be laser focused and use what's called targeted universalism to help those populations deal with the issues they're facing, whether that's a public health crisis, whether that's, systemic racism and institutional policies that are just not serving residents equally. It's just true. This idea of equal sounds nice, but we're definitely, we're not equal, and equal is not good enough, right? We need to really be talking about equality in the work that we do, and we're just not there. And so right now, the most important thing that I can be doing is helping my brothers and sisters in that fight and helping make sure that we're addressing those problems. And in doing that, focus my spending on solutions that also target those neighborhoods and those people so that, a rising tide raises all ships, right?
So it sounds to me like when you look at some of these, that you might see your role as working on issues that aren't directly related to climate change, but that ultimately are going to result in climate benefits. Is that a good way of putting it?
I think that's fair. What I would say is nationally, if you are a sustainability director in a municipality, a county, or a business, you better be talking about equity. That our job is equity. And if we're not trained to talk about equity, you better get trained to talk about equity. I mean, the discourse, and I know Alison is going to come on and talk in a little bit, or someone else is. Alison can share her perspective on this, but this is not, in our professional circles, this isn't an add-on. This is what we do, right? So sustainability and climate work is inherently about equity. And if it's not, we're probably not doing it right.
Yep. And we are lucky that we have some other folks who are working in Grand Rapids on some of those issues. So we definitely will hear from them. I do want to be mindful of your time and whether or not you need to move inside now. Do you have a few minutes left, or do you want to go right in?
I do, yeah.
Okay. Well, there have been some questions about kind of the way in which the emissions inventory, some of the logistics of the emissions inventory in Ann Arbor and how that was collected. What's the process been for that, and how have you found the support and the resources to even get your arms around the problem to be able to quantify it?
Yeah, there's standards and protocols that are out there for how to do a greenhouse gas inventory as a local government to make sure that there's apples to apples comparisons. So New York's doing an inventory the same way Grand Rapids and Ann Arbor and LA are doing inventories. In terms of capacity to do that work, we've leveraged for sure student capacity. We have the largest sustainability office in the state of Michigan. When we're fully staffed, which we are not right now, but we will be soon, we'll be 6 full-time people. And that is amazing. It's also like Alison and I talk about also sharing staff frequently, because 6 people sounds great, but 6 people cannot make carbon neutrality in 10 years, right? Like we need an army of people that are all sort of working collaboratively together. But I do have someone on my team who is our metrics expert. And so she does the inventory. She's been trained. She's gone through all of the, she's an expert in the protocols and methodologies. And so she tracks down the data. We built processes so that it becomes automated. We're working with IT. We now have a formal IT liaison to sustainability because we cause so much trouble. We break a lot of systems in the city because we use a lot of data. And so they're helping us automate all of this work. So hopefully we can, make this really, really easy to track our progress and then focus all of our time and attention on driving those numbers down.
And are there ways in which community organizations and kind of grassroots community groups can help with that process?
For sure. I think I would say the most useful thing is you're going to want numbers that are robust. And so probably following up with your community planner, if you are in a community that's got a sustainability director or someone to understand, have they done an inventory? How can you help? And then familiarizing yourself with the protocols. I'll drop one in the chat so people can see it. It's called ICLEI, ICLEI, and they have the standard protocol for how you do a greenhouse gas inventory for a municipality, but then also for the community as a whole. And it is super helpful. Like, it's time consuming to do an inventory, especially the first time. I can imagine, depending on the needs of your liaisons, that's helpful, right? Like it takes a lot of time to build those relationships and get data.
So going back a little bit to the equity and inclusion issues that you were talking about before, how is it, understanding, and as an environmental advocate myself, certainly I look at the environmental movement and recognize that we've done a really poor job of bringing diverse voices to the table. We do a really good job of saying that we care about equity and inclusion and that we want to represent all those voices, but we're not very good at actually hearing from them. So how has the city of Ann Arbor actually made sure that that the right people are at the table, like this guy here?
Yeah, he needs to be at the table. I get it. Poorly. So I'm going to lead with authenticity. I think that's really critical. So one is reaching out and asking them and understanding their needs and their concerns first before leading with our needs and our concerns. We are trying to go to their meetings and just sit in the background, like showing up and understanding and like regular showing up and helping build that trust and that rapport. It's making room at decision-making tables for those individuals. So asking explicitly, like, what's the composition of our boards and commissions? You know, I know we're talking about racial equity, but I'll tell you, one of the things when we did our first public survey, one of the things that distraught me the most is we had 0 people under the age of 18 take our survey, right? And so that was really problematic for us. Obviously, youth are going to be impacted the longest by climate change. And so we met with our climate activists in our middle school and high schools, and we asked them, like, why didn't you? What did we do wrong? And they became advisors to us, and they helped get the youth voice out, and they used things like TikTok and other memes, things that like we just totally, you know, like my kid's 5, I'm not there yet, you know, like I don't know what people are using. They helped drive that message, and we let them lead it. They ran a youth summit a few weeks ago, and all we did was give them technology, and we asked speakers for them, but we're just letting them drive. And I think that's part of the movement that we're trying to move forward with, is to to use our platform for other people's voices to be elevated, but not make it about our voice and our success. And then the last thing I would say is in our programming, I'm trying to be honest about who we serve and how we serve them. And the example that comes to mind is we won a grant to do this aging in place program to help our low income seniors age in a place that they're choosing for longer. You may not know this about me. I am not an aging senior. I'm also not low income. So I do not know what it's like to be either of those things. And so in the grant, we built money to hire a low income senior or someone who's worked with low income seniors. And actually we're going to hire a few of them. So not one person is kind of bearing the weight of that entire populace, but we are going to pay them to help us attract people and design the program from the very beginning, because I am a very well-intended, affluent white woman. Just truth.
Yep. No, I appreciate that, and I'm glad to see the way you guys are thinking about it. I'm going to ask you one last question before we release you to your duties as mother and daughter and many other roles. If you could change one thing, I saw that the cleaning the grid is sort of number 1 of the 7 goals. So if there's one thing that you could change about the way our energy generation is provided in the state of Michigan, or our energy policy, what would it be?
I get to make one energy policy change. Okay. I am so torn because I want 4 of them at once. I literally cannot decide, so I'm not going to answer your question. I'm going to answer the question I want to answer, which is
say all 4 if you want.
we have to blow the cap off of distributed generation. That's just ludicrous. I still think, and I know we're unlikely to win this battle, but I think we need more choice in our markets. I think franchise agreements, long-term franchise agreements like what we're locked into, are stupid. I think they need to go. Like I think that's ridiculous. And then just like the freedom package of bills, the fact that we can't microgrid, it's ludicrous. There's just so many constraints in our energy infrastructure that I do not understand. And we hear lots of things about the resilience of the grid. Well, I think that's just crap, because a more resilient grid is one that's decentralized. And so I don't buy it.
Yep. Well, the good news is we've got some packages of bills that have been going around in different forms for a couple of years. And I think that you'll agree with me that that is a place where community groups and folks who are interested and involved on this call can absolutely make a difference just by you know, talking to their legislators and being educated on those points.
Greta, we need the 2021 building code adopted. That's what people need to activate around right now. It is highly unlikely, but if we get the 2021 building code adopted, that means, and they adopt the zero code appendix, that municipalities can start regulating to zero, like all new builds and major renovations to be zero emissions. And I can do electrification work, which I cannot do right now. So 2021 building code, push it.
We've got one absolutely discrete thing to rally around. So thank you, Missy. If you can hang out and come in and out or do whatever, we're happy to have you do that, but we know that you have other stuff going on tonight. So what the plan is right now, unless David tells me differently, is that we're gonna move on and we're gonna have a conversation with a couple of folks from Grand Rapids who are involved in the C4 group. So we should have on the call Sergio Sierra Reyes, and I don't know if it's Sergio or Sergio, and you'll have to apologize, or you'll have to forgive me if I said that wrong. With a name like Margreta, I'm used to all sorts of maulings, and I know that it can be frustrating. But he's the Director of Community Engagement at the Urban Core Collective. The Urban Core Collective's mission is to uplift historically marginalized communities to a place of greater self-sufficiency by unifying communities of color in order to reduce the effects of systemic racism. And the Urban Core Collective has been involved with the City of Grand Rapids and is working with the City of Grand Rapids on trying to address some of these issues of climate change and to address some of these issues of equity. And so it's really excellent to have some representation from that group on this call so that people can start to get familiar with how that is working. We also have Aaron Ferguson, who's from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services with the Climate and Health Adaptation he's the Climate and Health Adaptation Program Manager. And you may have seen him at local events talking about C4 and talking about sort of climate collaboratives. So we've got some folks in our Grand Rapids community here, and I'm really just gonna push it over to you guys so that you can help us understand what it is that you're doing and what it is that, that folks on this call can do to help you in the work that you're moving forward with.
Great, thanks. I'm going to kick things off. I'm Aaron Ferguson. As mentioned, I manage the Michigan Climate and Health Adaptation Program at the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, and I'm one of 20 members of the Community Collaboration on Climate Change Planning Committee here in Grand Rapids. And I've, in the past, worked with the City of Grand Rapids, helping to initialize some of the early sustainability planning work and worked with some of the environmental organizations in the community. And now in my role, I work with communities across the state and with partners across the country to look at the health impacts from climate change and to try to work with communities to build resilience. And that's both adaptation and preparing for the impacts that we're already seeing, and then looking at how can we reduce or eliminate the impacts from climate change altogether. But today I'm going to focus my part of the talk on just introducing what the Community Collaboration on Climate Change, or C4, is, and then and where it's going, and then Sergio is going to jump in and talk about some of the goals and what we've learned so far, and about some of the specific work that we're doing. So I'm going to share my screen. Maybe. I don't know if somebody needs to give me that permission.
I think you might need to be given host authority.
Yeah, is that not working for you right now? Because it should be.
It just says host disabled participant screen sharing.
All right.
When I click on it.
There you go. Try that.
All right, now I think it'll work. All right, thank you. And while I'm pulling this up, I just want to say thank you to David and GRCA and Margreta and all the partners here, MyCan, for allowing us to present. This kind of came together last minute, and so it was, this is a great opportunity for us to hear from what's going on in Ann Arbor and Missy and the great work that she's doing, and then for us to share this C4 initiative, and also talk with this group about how you can have some input and how we can build this initiative going forward. So C4 really started with the idea that, climate change is already impacting the Grand Rapids area. It's impacting communities around the country. Here in Grand Rapids, many public and private organizations have recognized this and have developed initiatives to reduce greenhouse gases while also protecting and enhancing infrastructure, the environment, and public health. However, the work at large, we know, has not successfully engaged communities of color, nor has it achieved in a comprehensive way the desired widespread results for communities of color. So often our communities of color are the first and hardest impacted, and oftentimes because of the historic and systemic racism that is built into a lot of our policies and our systems, they're held out from the benefits of the climate work that we are doing. So, and this isn't just true for Grand Rapids, this is true across the country and across the world. And there's some studies that have come out recently from the University of Michigan that identified the greater Grand Rapids area as having several spots where environmental injustice is occurring right here and right now. And so we know amidst the context of that environmental justice and equity problems that climate change is a threat multiplier, which means that those existing inequities can be made worse as climate change progresses. And so the C4 group really formed around this concept that the solutions require a recognition of our past failures and a new collaborative multi-sector approach that truly centers equity at the core of the mission. So when the group launched in early 2019, I was there for that initial launch, and when we looked around the room, we saw that it was mostly white, and it was mostly a lot of the traditional environmental folks that are at these types of conversations. And so we quickly recognized that we needed to expand the planning group of this to be more diverse, to be more reflective of the community. And so we expanded what we call the planning committee or the planning team to include about 20 different stakeholders, which was to develop this initial proposal for funding. And so that's what we've done with this planning committee, which is about 52% are people of color on this group. And what we did is we asked the Wege Foundation for a 6-month planning grant. Initially, we thought we would go right out of the gate and apply for a 3-year planning grant that would set us on the path to what Ann Arbor is doing right now. But we, recognize that when you're really centering equity, it takes time. And that's something that this group has had to face is the threat that climate change poses and the timeline, the intensive timeline that climate action requires, with the necessity to build trust and to do the equity work takes time. And so we're trying to bring those two things together. And we've done that by requiring the folks that are on the planning team to participate in 12 hours of equity training that was hosted by Urban Core Collective. And we've also done presentations where some of the more traditional environmental groups present to the whole group. And so we're trying to learn what each other's programs are, what our goals are, where are we already working in the community, and how can we wrap together. And so with that funding from the Wege Foundation, the group was able to hire a facilitator who is, as of right now, taking the group through this process of outlining what a 3-year proposal would look like. So it says creation of a 3-year plan, but basically we're trying to create a proposal that can then get funded to do this 3-year plan. Here's a slide with some of the names of the people that have participated so far. Some people have moved in and out, and we're still looking for the best representation possible in this. And there's going to be more opportunities going forward as well. Here's a little timeline of where we've been and where we hope to go in the future. We really started a lot of this work actually initially in April, and have done the equity training. We're right now developing some visions and outlining what that plan looks like, and Sergio is going to give some of the details on that. We hope that by the beginning of August, we're going to have a first draft of this 3-year proposal. And once we have that draft, we're going to open it up for feedback from our broader network, which includes GRCA and a lot of the other members on this call. So this is going to be the first opportunity that we're really opening up for broader input. But I also want to just emphasize that this is just the beginning, really. Once we have this proposal put together and then we get it funded, then the real work starts and we can start engaging community, meeting community where they are, learning what their needs are, and start building those actions, not just outlining what the problems are, but really building towards action moving forward. So, and then in August and September, we plan to have this final package ready to put forth for funding.
So Aaron, if you don't mind me interrupting,
Sure.
I'm really fascinated in how you're reconciling the tension between this urgency of climate change and the need to be thoughtful and to take the time to really do the equity and inclusion piece right. Like, do you find that there's going to be a solution to that, or is that just going to be a tension that will persist throughout the work?
I think it's a tension that's going to persist, and I think as Missy mentioned, we have to learn to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And because we've avoided this discussion around equity and justice for so long, it is uncomfortable for many of us that haven't experienced this, lived it day to day. So as we're learning to do this, it does feel very uncomfortable. And sometimes it feels like it doesn't jive well with what would be a traditional climate action plan. But I think as a group, what we've started to see over time is we're starting to recognize that they're one and the same. We have to be able to address the justice and equity issues as effectively and efficiently and timely as we do climate. Those issues aren't mutually exclusive. And so that's what we're trying to come together is it's not one or the other, it's both.
Great. And so I'm not sure with the, I just want to make sure that we have plenty of time to hear also from Sergio, who I will admit I right now feel uncomfortable because I pronounced his name wrong. And so I'm sitting with that level of discomfort. Want to make sure that we can get to that. So I won't interrupt you again so that we can sort of move forward on that presentation.
Yeah. So I'll hand it over to Sergio now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Margaret. You pronounced my name right. I was hoping to be able to share my screen to continue it's actually the same slide. Let me see if I can share that. So here we go. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep, we can see it, Sergio.
Okay. So the Urban Core Collective is not necessarily an organization. We're an equity partner with the City of Grand Rapids. So I'll speak from that perspective as a member of C4 with the City of Grand Rapids and with Aaron and other folks from that group. As I mentioned before, we're a racial equity organization, and we're new to this work, just stepping into this line of work with environmental justice. So some of these goals I wanted to cover really speak to that. So the goals are to support the work of organizations already doing this work, the grassroots organizations that are environmental in nature. And then we want to elevate awareness of environmental injustices that are occurring in Grand Rapids. And then the last goal is to create space and provide resources to communities of color, and so that we can create an environmental justice agenda for communities of color. And I'll talk in a moment about why that's so important to us. And this should inform how the city goes on to implement this work. And finally, to ensure that the needs of communities of color are better served throughout Grand Rapids. Okay. And so I wanted to talk about some lessons learned thus far. What we learned thus far is that we need to start with trust and build relationships. I think one of the things, as Aaron mentioned before, we have quite an impressive group of people serving these communities, but it wasn't always so. I think at some point we thought about we made a stop, and it's something that we need to discuss, like covering my last point right now. To build coalitions, it needs to precede the design. I think historically we have, or environmental action organizations have first developed the plan, the goals, the strategy, and then approach communities of color to participate in these goals once the table has been set, once the plan, once a vision for a future that is based on a specific lived experience of those people that form and that lead environmental action organizations. And so the challenge that we experience from community is that we're invited to a table that's already set, and this vision doesn't align with our lived experience. Like, for example, today we're voting, the City Commission in Grand Rapids there's gonna be a motion to reduce the police budget to 32%. And so how do we get communities of color to prioritize the work that we're discussing now? And so that first we need to start with that trust and building relationships so that we're all on the first page, and then acknowledge the past lived experiences of all the people at the table as being valid. Also, ensuring that we're all on the same page, that we all understand what environmental action, the priorities are, but on both sides. And when I found this encouraging, that when when communities of color and organizations representing communities of color asked the city to, or as part of the work plan and part of the planning process, we asked to have somebody to kind of guide us through what we don't know, what all the players at the members at the table already understand about climate change, what we have to work with, what's been tried, what hasn't been tried. We wanted to know that, but we were encouraged to hear from environmental action organizations at the table, from Bill, which I saw in the comments. They wanted it to be on the same page with us on equity. And so the Urban Core Collective did an equity training session, and now we're engaging with the SRG to get us caught up with the planning now. And then, so that's important with the defining common terms. And then we collaborated on a new vision that I want to share with you. And in that vision, I think it's so important. I know that Missy shared their own vision, and our vision, I think, is one that involves both experiences of the traditional organizations, the grassroots environmental action organizations, and then communities of color that we want it to be a joint leadership. And that's my next point, that we cannot expect communities of color to be invited to the table and to participate again in action that is not led by them. And we often want to focus so much on a shared vision or on a shared agenda, but what if we what if we allowed communities of color to develop their own environmental action agenda, and we work in partnership to move both agendas forward, understanding that there's going to be a significant overlap, but that agency that we allow communities of color in developing their own agenda is going to move us forward by generations and developing trust and ownership of this, buy-in of this. And also acknowledging that we all have real assets and expertise to contribute. And we need to stop seeing communities of color as people that we bring to the table, that we convince, that we enlighten with our experience on climate change, or how we see climate change, or the plan that we have, and instead seeing them as allies that we need in order to make progress. The progress that we're seeing now with police, that we're seeing on equity work in Grand Rapids, that build capacity to influence city politics. Environmental action organizations need that built knowledge and expertise to move forward environmental action agenda. And then the last that I already mentioned is that we need to move, coalition building needs to proceed the design. And that's I guess the summary of what we were just discussing. And I want to share with you a draft.
Jump in, Sergio, real quick. I'm sorry, just because I think this is a good place to ask it, but with everything that you're saying about the, having groups involved in and communities of color actually involved in putting together what plans look like and not having it be this kind of, sort of paternalistic information gathering process where you have established groups who are well-funded coming down and saying, well, okay, so what do you think about these great plans we're putting together? One thing that strikes me is that it takes a lot of resources and it takes a lot of work. And I'm lucky enough that I've got a job that pays me to work in this space. But is there a plan to help compensate communities of color and community groups for development of those kinds of plans and for participating in driving that movement?
We're definitely going to bring that up for sure. But I want to say that I know Missy mentioned Alison a lot, and I just want to give her credit for and other collaborations with Zero Cities that we have. The funding makes its way to us. The grants do make their way to the partner organizations, and we're definitely going to make that a conversation for all the members of the planning. The community collaboration on climate change is one at UCC. We believe in no extraction without compensation, and I think so. To answer your question, that has not been officially established, but I think we're not at that point to say. But when that time comes, we will definitely have that discussion. So just the vision that we came up with, an initial vision, I think that represents that the centrist people of color as the impacted community, frontline communities, I believe we refer to them in this field. And there's the shared leadership aspect of it, and that the strategies, resources to curb the impacts of climate change are centered on these communities of color. And so, and also, it's a vision statement, right? So that are climate change organizations, that people of color are one and the same, that the people that are working in this field are look like those communities that we want to impact and that we want to bring on board, because I think that would, I think that's the manifestation of that intent. And I think that I'll stop sharing my screen. If any questions, if anybody has any questions, I can take them now, but that's community collaboration and climate change in Grand Rapids.
Great, Sergio. I'm really glad that you and Aaron were here, and my understanding is you're going to be able to stick around to answer questions after we hear a little bit from Kimmy from GR Climate Action. Is that right?
Yes. Yep.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it over to Kimmy and ask her to talk a little bit about Grand Rapids climate action and some of the work that she's been doing also in the Creston neighborhood. I know that she's been working on organizing in that area and doing a lot of work there. And I think that she's really here to talk about some of that work. And then we'll open it up after Kimmy speaks. And I think I'm getting the pronunciation right, Kimmy?
Yes.
Okay, good. So then we'll open it up to sort of a group discussion that I'll try to control a little bit and moderate a little bit, but also give people a little bit more freedom than I have been thus far. So Kimmy, why don't you take it away, and then we'll move into kind of group question and answer and discussion.
Thanks, Margareta. Yeah, I work as the community organizer for the Creston Neighborhood Association. I'm also a member of Grand Rapids Climate Action. And so I've been working in kind of two tangential areas to address climate change. With GRCA, we put out an 18-point call to action last year, and it does include, as Ann Arbor has successfully done, a community-wide carbon neutrality by 2030. And a lot of the other points in that 18-point document just lead to that. And we kind of don't want to look at every single point by point. We want to look at it in its entirety. And I think that's really important. And I think that's what Ann Arbor has done beautifully And in the Creston neighborhood in particular, we were able to secure a grant from the Weggy Foundation. And we are basically working for a year pilot program to increase energy efficiency for our lower income neighbors by reducing their utility costs through energy efficiency activities, and to create a climate chaos committee, named so because we already think that much of the world is experiencing climate chaos. It's already here, and the sense of urgency is great. And so what we're looking at with both groups is the best possible way to move forward. And given the work that the C4 group is doing is paramount, we definitely don't want to jump the gun and step on any toes. So it's very exciting that in just a handful of weeks, they're going to be making an initial presentation of the draft of how to proceed forward, which is awesome. But I really want to say, not as a spokesperson for GRCA or the Creston neighborhood, just as a member of GRCA and a facilitator of the Climate Chaos Committee, that we really need to have a sense of urgency. I would personally love to see us put pressure on the City Commission and Kent County where it's appropriate to adopt the same goal, not necessarily to come out with a plan at the get-go, but a goal of Grand Rapids becoming carbon neutral by 2030. And of course, I agree with Sergio 100% in terms of coalition building has to come before the design of how we would get there by 2030. But I think we all need to seriously consider making that commitment to put pressure on the City Commission of Grand Rapids to at least set that goal. That's all.
Great, thanks, Timmy. And I think that does kind of bring us into what I think can be a really interesting conversation between people who are participating, watching, asking questions, and some of our panelists, given this sense of urgency, given that in Grand Rapids, we seem to be developing some really good infrastructure for addressing both climate change or not for addressing both climate change and equity, because I think as Missy and other folks have said, it's not a this and that, right? It's all one thing. It's all part of a similar, it's the same problem and an issue that we need to address. What are the things that that as a community and as individuals and small organizations we see as obstacles to coming together? What do we see as ways in which groups can be more effective in kind of in targeting a goal of climate neutrality, of getting that to the city of Grand Rapids, and for pushing that forward with the city council? So I think that that's what folks are interested in. If you want to raise your hand, it'll make it a little bit easier for me to call on people who have thoughts, who have ideas, who have questions that they want to put out there for the group. And I think I can see your hands when you do raise them. All right, so what I'll do is start, while people are sort of getting the technology under control and getting their questions developed. I think that one question I have, especially for Sergio and Aaron, traditionally working with traditional environmental groups, you don't have to explain this sense of urgency. I think when working with broader community groups that aren't focused on environment, who aren't focused on energy, but who are likely impacted by climate change and by environmental issues, what are the ways in which to kind of create a sense of urgency or or maybe understand where in the spectrum and the hierarchy of needs things like climate fall. You know, what's your sort of approach to that and working with community groups?
I can speak a little bit to that. That's initially the challenge. That was a challenge for us at the Urban Core Collective when we were working with the city of Grand Rapids on a partnership for 0 cities, and it was how do we bring you know, the climate change, which impacts us all, and it's a significant priority, to their front burner. And one of the things that we discuss is, I think that the relationship building, I think that it's about relationships. If there's the trust, if trust has been established with whoever it is that's reaching out to communities of color or to other groups that are not in this field, I think that trust and that the network of those organizations then can be leveraged through community. I think the education is definitely a key, but I think there's also the acknowledgement. There's like this back and forth that takes place, that listen to me and understand me and see what I'm about, and then I'll do the same for you. And I think that's key in understanding communities of color. But the trust building is probably, I would say, the most important, where there is a history. That's why I mentioned it, and acknowledging past experiences, where it's understanding the dynamic of the relationship that existed with communities of color. Like, how have they related to cities, to systems, with the police? Like, the only time you see the city is like when you get a parking ticket, when you have to pay your gas, your bills, when they come and tell you to mow your lawn or to fix your window, or if like you have to complain or you fight a ticket in court. If those are the circumstances in which you've engaged in a relationship with the city, and suddenly you have people from the city or from other organizations coming to you to tell you that there's this bigger looming, you know, problem that encompasses all, the messenger's credibility is then impacted. So I think that that's the approach that we're taking. And then I think finally working deeply to understand like colonialism and what colonialism has done to communities of color, to Indigenous and Black communities, and how they've taken us out. They've taken something from us that we're not complete anymore. We're no longer able to connect with nature and the environment and the land, and by like extension, the dire need to save and preserve these for our well-being and for leisure and then for our survival.
I just wanted to add on, I think one thing from, you know, someone who's worked in city and state government and has been to community meetings across the state and in Grand Rapids is the community is already telling us, is telling their representatives what they want to see. I mean, there's a lot of visioning workshops that happen, whether it's corridor improvement projects they want, you know, whether it's access to green space or more fresh food or concerns with housing. And so then it's up to the representatives and the government to look at how can we better deploy weatherization and energy efficiency in transportation to meet the needs that the community is already telling us that we need, but also has these co-benefits of climate change mitigation. And as Missy was saying, this emphasis on decentralized renewable energy and getting that up. How does that make a community more resilient when there is a climate-related event, whether it's the heat that we're experiencing right now, or storms, or flooding? How do these efforts to put in these mitigation and adaptation things, those have real benefits to the community, and if we're listening, we can pair those things. And that's why I really liked, Kimmy, what you were talking about from the Creston perspective, looking at energy efficiency and actually getting into the low-income homes and being able to do that work. That's the same thing at the state health department. We're looking at our weatherization program and measuring not only how much, you know, on people's utility bills does weatherization save, but what are the health implications of that? So there's a climate, health, and economic benefit right there. And if we can pull those pieces together and we're listening, then we can have a really effective strategy.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of what you guys are saying, I've listened to people kind of feel like they're going down this rabbit hole and slippery slope of, oh my gosh, is climate everything? Is sustainability everything? How can we kind of define what we're trying to do when it seems like what we're saying is every function and every decision and every piece of city governance and of our community organizations really needs to be thinking about and focusing on climate. I mean, is that kind of where we are, and is that where you guys see how we marry climate and equity? Like those are two things that should be part of every conversation, and should be part of every decision that we make, even if initially it doesn't seem like it's relevant.
I think I take a lesson for marketing, right? If product placement and all that, I believe that that's well established, well defined, and we know what works. But we need to understand that we need to meet people where they are, and we look at people as consumers. If it's like a couple of levels, right? If we're approaching people if we want to get people to participate with and join in our work, if we're thinking as them as leaders and partners and stakeholders, then we need to ensure that they have buy-in. If we're looking at them as consumers, as the public, then we need to understand that whatever it is that whatever behavior we want to see them change or engage in, then needs to be relevant. And that is directly related to our approaches, to whether our marketing is right, the language that we're using is right, and whether there is, it's tied to like a return on investment for the people that that are our target audience. And oftentimes it's not, right? We develop programs, let's say with the utility companies that are rebates. We talk about issues or programs that require like, that appeal to specific demographic that is already like the choir, right? And instead, we need to develop programs that we offer to people that appeal to a broader community, not just the people, not to the people that are already in tune with, or that politically or ideologically already identify as people that are conserving the environment and mitigating climate change.
Thank you, Sergio. So I think that noting that we're at 7:55, I think one thing that I'd like to do kind of in rounding this out, and sorry for all the kid noises, and sort of bringing this to a conclusion, and I hope that some of the folks who are listening and who join this because they're really interested in figuring out how we can all work together to get the city of Grand Rapids towards a climate neutrality goal, and to really make a meaningful move at the municipal level. If those who are participating have any thoughts on what's sort of the next step that a group like the Grand Rapids Climate Action Group, some of the other groups that are on this call, individuals who are just looking to see how they can get involved and can work in this area, what are some next steps to put pressure on the city commission to really work towards the type of goal that we've seen pass in Ann Arbor? So I'll give people just a second to maybe raise some hands. Bill Wood should be scared because he knows that I am a lawyer, and so I was subjected to the Socratic method, and I'm not afraid to call on people. But I won't do that to you, Bill. Bill thinks that's funny. Yeah, he didn't raise his hand. Well, I'm not seeing a whole lot of hand raises, which is fine, because I think that this is it's a hard question, right? Like, how do we move forward, and how do groups kind of work together to figure out next steps. And so I want to thank Aaron and Sergio and Kimmy, and also thank Missy, who's no longer on the line, to thank for taking their time to share with us some of their insights. I know we're all busy and we all have a lot of things going on, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time out of your days to bring people together. I think there will be follow-up work that we will all do. I think we're all living in the same community. We're all after the same goal. And I hope that one of the things we've learned from this is we're better off sharing ideas together and working together to try to reach that common goal.
Thank you, Margaret.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
All right, so I think that with that, we're gonna sign off, and we'll look forward to seeing you all around and talking to you all again soon. Take care and be safe.